This is the second part of our interview with Siân Esther Powell from the Celtic Myths and Legends Podcast. I hope you enjoy. And especially in Celtic rules with how like the family law structure in Wales was very different than, say, England. So your responsibility to your elder was actually more important to you than, say, the crown on occasion. And they had more to say in who you married and what you did than the crown ever did. So in a way, that you can see why the family would be much more important to most people than any nation state would be.
Oh yeah, old Welsh laws are brilliant, actually. I'm a good read of some of those. Yeah, they're really interesting when you look at ancient Welsh laws. And like you said, very, very different to English laws of the time as well.
Yeah, I mean, just simply, we've covered a lot on inheritance and how those vary. And it's funny because when you think of it from a modern perspective, you're like, well, that makes sense. But in that era, that was very different.
Well, if you think about it, there were so many different lords and petty kingdoms and things like this. And like I said, there was a real important emphasis put on lineage and genealogy. So you had to know that your son was your son. You had to know that your grandfather was your grandfather, because it was following this long kind of family line connecting you to what you owned, what was yours, what land was yours. So it's very important to have that kind of strong family structure, just to kind of protect your assets, really, if anything.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, that's what led to the split up of the various kingdoms, because the more family you have, the more opportunity they have to inherit. And it led to some fun discussions. But yeah, it's a very interesting sort of discussion to have. And I think it's kind of entertaining in some ways to kind of see how people interpret things differently and how they deal with it. And I know probably the most controversial subject I've ever brought up in this podcast is Arthur and the perceptions that people have about him. And I've actually had responses back saying, oh, how could you ever think that? It's so wrong. So you can see that people still value the older ideas, the old stories. Whether those old stories are accurate or not is always, I think it's still something that people look at and cling to. I don't know if that's the right word, but you know what I mean? Like,
I think so, in a way. People are very drawn to Arthur. Arthur exists not just in Welsh mythology, not just in French literature, not just in pop culture, but he's permeated everything, really. From music, Roxy music doing Avalon, to Mists of Avalon, the well-known book series, to all these places where you can find Arthur and this idea of Arthur. It's a legend that has escaped where its origins, if you will. It's so much bigger than just being, like I said, Welsh mythology or French literature. Arthur as a figurehead and as a hero is a hero that people cling to, is a hero that people are still very much interested in. And as a legendary hero, there's always this big interest in proving that legendary rulers and heroes were actually real. And then there's always the case of, oh, so he must have been from here. Oh, no, he must have been from here. So as I said earlier, made my little reference to Cornwall, because we've got our own ideas that Arthur was actually born in Tintagel. So you've got Tintagel Castle now that's looked after by English Heritage, and they really drum up that Arthurian narrative there when you visit it. It's brilliant, but it is very much drawing on legend and myths and legend to kind of draw up emotion in people, and it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably money.
Oh yeah, they need the money. Yeah.
I always think of that. It's always, whenever the kind of thing, it reminds me actually of Edward the First, when he discovered, in quotes, the burial places of Guinevere and Arthur, and there's all this coverage of kind of him bringing them out and honoring them, and they were like as if they had never lost, they were as if they were not dead, they were just asleep, sort of idea. And then he reburied them to make sure that the Welsh knew that he knew where they were and they weren't getting out. And it's just funny to me that just the way that this whole thing, which really does start in that like 11th and 12th century, has come to the point now where we write book after book after book trying to identify, as you said, where Arthur it really was from, which character, which kind of has the name sort of fits that category. And then I always go back to Gildas when it comes to this stuff, because Gildas is someone who's raging at people. I mean, he's basically writing his Old Testament shout fest, basically saying how bad the Welsh have gotten or the Britons have gotten, because of course they weren't Welsh then, and how this is why we have this plague of Saxons. And he never brought up an Arthur. So you're kind of like, well, if he'd have been looking back at some golden age and there's no mention, kind of makes you wonder.
Well, exactly, especially as they would have been contemporaries, because Gildas, if I that might be completely wrong, was a 6th century. He was in the 6th century, and that's where Arthur was supposedly from as well, 5th or 6th century ruler or hero. So they would have been contemporaries, or he would have at least heard of Arthur, surely.
Yeah, considering. Yeah, you would think. Yeah, this is why people usually point to Ambrosius as the Arthurian possibility, because he's the one that sort of is mentioned as being the noble good guy, the former Roman official who did something really good, but nobody really can identify that for sure. And that's where I always sort of say there's nothing wrong with following myths and having beliefs in myths, but you have to couch it in kind of realism on some of these things. And with Arthur, it's very difficult to say definitely a yes or definitely a no. That's where we're at. So
I think there's a real attraction to that kind of romanticism as well, of was he real, was he not? Like you said, Edward the First or Edward the Second, I can't remember.
First.
Yeah, Edward the First, unveiling like the burial places of former Welsh nobles. It's it's ancient tourism. It makes sense. People are very attracted to this idea of where people were buried, where people were born, where people lived, who they knew. So yeah. It's very
pilgrimage was a big part of religious upbringing in those eras too.
Pilgrimage was all about money.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, I get that. But in the mentality of the people of the time, it was kind of like, oh, I need to do this. Now, of course, it's all about a tourist trap, effectively.
Even at the time, pilgrimage is really interesting, actually, because I feel like pilgrimage is different for some people and it is different for other people. For example, pilgrim sites for the monks actually living in a site that was being visited was about money, because pilgrims bring a lot of money. They stay there, they eat your food, they drink your wine or what have you. Monks did like to brew lots of wine and other things. They might not like to admit that, but they did. But for the people visiting these sites of pilgrimage, they're spiritual sites. You're wanting to have some kind of spiritual journey, some kind of learning, epiphany. And then for other people, like I said, the people that are there, it's about money. It's about making money. As an interesting thing with the church, you can have the spiritual element to it and also the kind of monetary element as well.
Yeah, for sure. The last episode that we've just recorded, or I keep saying we, but it's me, talked a lot about how the church was transitioning in this period and kind of becoming much more powerful, to the point where they owned 1/3 of the land in Western Europe. So of course they wanted to keep having money flow in as much as possible, especially with the way they were building at the time. So it makes sense. And I don't discredit some of the ideas, but obviously, when everybody has a piece of the cross, eventually, sooner or later, it's going to be bigger than the cross. It's just the way it works. But yeah, no, I think in a way that's what myths do. We think about like the way war memorials are treated in this day and age, kind of how there's sort of that idea of pilgrimage with those kind of things, or going to your nation's capital, or all of those kind of ideals that people have about, what area is significant to them or what has a sentiment to them, and kind of how people will talk about them when they go there. They usually talk about them in almost reverential tones, which you can kind of see how that would be something, in an era where magic exists, where ideas about the closeness of the spiritual world is very strong. I think there'd be even, to my mind, a greater attachment to those kind of things. Like, I think that's why the stories and the myths were held on to so strongly, because they were kind of linking people back to a different sort of environment, a different world, I guess, be it, an old history or even sort of like leprechauns and this kind of thing, where it's all just, where people acknowledge that they're not real or not historical, but maybe they believe they're real, or maybe they have a concept that they exist. And, or the fairies or the elves or any number of different things that ran around. So it's one thing I've thought about is just how that kind of gives people a sense of place, a sense of hope. And like I say, it allows them to sort of link to other things outside of themselves, maybe. Because I think that's what religion does, but I suspect there was things outside of that from, like I say, myths and legends. I mean, one of the things we've talked a little bit about on the podcast is how when the church reached Britain, there were all these Celtic gods floating around, and eventually they became, at least in some cases, Celtic saints, because the church couldn't make headway of getting rid of them, it seemed.
Yeah, there's a really interesting kind of intersection between kind of paganism and Christianity in a lot of the Celtic lands, because a lot of the things that people think are very Celtic, are very pagan, are actually Christian, or at least kind of very, very early Christian. A lot of imagery that's quite kind of tying into green men and things like that. It's actually, you see it, it's not a very old piece of imagery. You visit a lot of old churches in Cornwall and in Wales as well, and there's always a Celtic cross in front of them. This idea of being kind of different is, I think Cornwall and Wales have a lot of there's a lot of parallels between the two. You can definitely see that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think they remained in conversation as long as they were both independent too. That's one thing I've definitely noticed, like trade and all that continued to exist between the Old North, which is basically the
Hi, I'm Nikesh Ragani, commentator and host of the India on 99.94 podcast. Several times each week, my co-host Sarah Warris and I will be bringing you the very best in Indian cricket chat, whether we're discussing the legend of Jhulan Goswami, KL Rahul's strike rate, the men's T20 death bowling woes, or the latest controversy involving the BCCI, we've got you covered. You can listen and subscribe via your usual podcast provider. Just search for India on 99.94. You can watch us via YouTube, and you can download the 99.94 app. If you love Indian cricket, then join our conversation.
A news story gets shared by a friend on social media, or you catch a tweet that really makes your blood boil. But how do you separate fact from fiction? That's the premise behind Disinformation, a 10-part series from Evergreen Podcasts and Emergent Risk International coming this fall. Tune into Disinformation wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, don't believe everything you read.
Greetings from Evergreen Podcasts. We're rolling out a listener survey, and we want to hear from you. The information in the survey will help us gather statistics and in turn make our shows more appealing to advertisers. I know most people don't like ads, but this is one of the only ways our shows make money and help keep their lights on. We promise it will only take a few minutes, but the impact on our podcasts will be tremendous. As a token of our appreciation, we'll randomly select one lucky participant each month to win an exclusive merchandise package from Evergreen Podcasts. Head to evergreenpodcast.com/listener survey to help a show and possibly get some free stuff for doing so. We can't thank you enough for the support. Now back to the show.
English-Scottish border area where there were still Britons, and then down to Cornwall where they were, still working within each other. I mean, Tintagel had been getting copper from Wales, for example, as one of the places where they got it from. So they had contacts to Byzantium from what we understand. So they had connections to the outside world that still linked them back to Rome, going into the later antiquity and early medieval periods, which I think is interesting and I think very fascinating to sort of look at. And you can kind of see how stuff would just sort of spread between all those groups, because there'd still be, sailors coming in and bringing, stories of different events and adventures and all that kind of stuff. So it'd still trickle in from various places. And certainly as Christianity moved in, I often say when you look at Christianity's development in Western Europe, what you see is it kind of not just simply taking over, but merging into the common culture. There isn't like a track where you say, oh yeah, definitely after this, they totally did everything different. I mean, one of the things I brought up the other day on Twitter was the idea and the concept of the wearing of white. The idea of the pontiff were actually Roman pagan religious thoughts. They weren't Christian. Those came later. And certainly that kind of influence and sharing of cultural ideals happened here as well. I think in Britain, it's pretty obvious that happened.
It's definitely a gradual process. And I think in the same way that you have, as you were saying earlier about Indigenous cultures having this kind of narrative about being pushed out, in the same way that you have this Welsh narrative about being kind of pushed out of their own lands, you also have this idea from some people that believe that pagans were kind of pushed out of their lands by Christians. And I don't know if it really was like that. It was more, perhaps it was in a way, but it was more a gradual process of adopting elements of local people's folklore and culture and kind of assimilating that into the church. So I'm not a Christian scholar. I don't know too much about the kind of gradual process of Christianity in the British Isles and in Europe, but it is definitely a topic that I think deserves a lot more discussion and a lot more kind of discussion outside of just this romanticized view of Christians versus pagans.
Yeah, you have to understand. I mean, we always look back at the bigger stories, like where the Saxons fought the Germanic Franks and were forcibly converted, and that kind of becomes sort of the storyline for, oh, that must have been how it happened to everybody. But I mean, these were, all you have to do is read a bit of Bede and you realize that that's not actually how things happened. It was a very, very gradual process. Still pagan Anglo-Saxons Saxons running around well into the 8th century. I mean, and 9th century. So
yeah, if you look at old kind of Irish literature, for example, I did cover it in my podcast actually, The Voyage of Maelduin. These were written by religious men. These were written by men of the church. The only ones literate at the time in Ireland, but they incorporate kind of fantastical elements and very, fantasy things. And there's a druid in that story who actually tells the hero, who's a secular hero, he tells the hero what to do. And his advice is actually correct. So you have this druid character that could be seen as a pagan. And he's not an evil character. He's actually completely true in his prophecy. And I always thought that was quite an interesting element, that you have this story, obviously, presumably written by a Christian, written by a monk, that's not showing paganism and Irish folklore and fantasy in a negative light. It's very much a joining of two things.
Yeah, and I think you really don't see that sort of orthodox versus unorthodox until you get to the medieval period, where there does become a threat to the overall orthodoxy And that's where I think the collision starts to happen, because I mean, just on the basis of how things were kind of dealt with, I mean, there was still a lot of the things that we just assume were in Christian thinking prior to the medieval period, I don't even think existed until the medieval period. So I think it's something you have to be very aware of when you look at these kind of things. And I think we make assumptions based on our predetermined notion of whether it's good or bad. And I'm not here to say one way or the other, but I think there is some commonality and some understanding that has to be made by people to sort of realize that things were probably not as fast or as quick as it's described in history. Quite often, historical writings are tilted by the writers of the history. Like the idea of a Saxon being strictly someone who came from overseas, from Germany, and settled and then just basically killed off any Briton that was in their way, is provably false. But there's still a lot of people that hold to that. There's still enough people that think that happened, that it's like trying to talk to them, to say, well, even a middle ground becomes very difficult to have that conversation. And it's interesting because you have so much of that wrapped up in the myth. I mean, Bede's stories and Gildas's are nothing more than myth, different than Arthur. Hengist and Horsa and all those people may or may not have existed. And the story of the foundation of Anglo-Saxon domination in England is at best speculative. And I think we have to be careful when we, a proper academic historian would always say you have to be careful about these kind of things. You can't make those kind of blanket statements because we just don't know. And archaeologists would be very clearly able to point out where that would be identifiably false, where you have grave sites which have Celtic people being buried beside Saxon people. You have people who are obviously from other places who are wearing clothes that are identifiably Celtic. There's nothing that says for sure one way or the other that this is what happened. It's just we have these writings that we have to take into account and be mindful that they're writing a history. It's just you have to be careful to say, okay, how much of this can I say for sure is accurate, or how much of this can I say for sure isn't? If I can't say for sure, then I should at least qualify that when I'm talking, so that people understand that, yes, we think it's this way, but we don't know it's this way. And
I mean, yeah, certainly. I mean, especially when you start looking at history, ancient history, that's kind of half or more than half shrouded in myth and legend rather than actual archaeological and actual literary records. You have people view that then, and they take, like you said, people take their own preconceived biases and notions and then imprint that on whatever pieces of evidence that they can find to agree with that. And you have to realize that a lot of our history kind of is seen through the lens of historians, and they weren't unbiased at all.
No. Yeah, and I would argue it's very difficult to be completely unbiased in any of these circumstances. Always looking at things via perspectives that we're brought up in. I mean, our understanding of nation states is categorically different than the way they existed prior to, say, the 1700s. And yet we'll still look at things through that lens because that's our understanding. So I think the big trick is to be able to say, as an academic, to go and say, okay, knowing that, how do I look at this in a way that makes sense to what was going on instead of what I perceive was going on, or the assumption I want to make when looking at a document that says, oh, this person's just like me and I see exactly what they're going through because it's just exactly like what I go through. And yet you go, well, yes and no. And it's interesting. I think history is incredibly fascinating. I think and I love looking at the mythology that goes around it because I think it's integral to how we perceive our histories. And there's a lot of talk in academic circles about the idea of memory and kind of what that does to people where what you think happened is more important than what really happened. Because if an event happens to you, you might write it down when the event happens, to kind of not go into this in huge detail, but say you're in a car accident, you wrote it down at that moment, and you gave out everything you knew about the accident. Then 7 or 8 years later, somebody says, hey, you were involved in this accident. What do you remember about it? And then you spout again what you remember. Well, now what you remember has probably been influenced by, forgetting some things, what may have happened in the aftermath. If there's a police report or if it made the news media, you maybe remember more than you probably did at the time. And some cases, you probably remember less than what you did at the time. And so you're writing down that history, in quotes, can be difficult to sort of extrapolate as being the same level as the one that you wrote when it happened. And both could be accurate, but they might be accurate from different angles, or they both could be very inaccurate for different reasons. And so I think historians grapple with that all the time. I mean, it's when you're doing ancient history, one of the things that always comes to mind is a professor talking about this one time with me, about the idea that when you have ancient sources, you have to understand at higher level, when you're looking at something that's been written like in the 1900s, we have World War II, you have so many sources you pull from that incident, from the day of the incident in any point in the war, from government documents down to someone's personal journal to letters they were writing back home. But if you look at a ancient source, and the Dark Ages, in the late antiquity, you would find that you're basing everything on one guy who may be writing 300 or 400 years later. And that, the founding of Rome is a great example of that. I mean, according to them, they came from Troy, which we know is patently false, but that was what they understood to be the case.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I did my bachelor's in ancient history. Actually, I love ancient history. I'm definitely not an academic snob. I think folklore and mythology is just as much an important historical tool as literature and as archaeology. So I don't want to mock people for kind of reading into ancient history and reading into things through their own lens. But it's definitely something to remember, isn't it? That when you get to this period of history where you don't have literary references, where you don't have archaeological evidence or any kind of reference in law books, in courts, anywhere at the time that might have named someone, when you don't have that name and someone does kind of become part of a legend, it's easy to kind of put all of our beliefs and thoughts on that person then. Whereas I think what's so attractive about Owen Glyndŵr is we know that he existed. We know that he was a real person. So it's really easy then to make a kind of romantic hero out of him and put all these legends and kind of myths and romanticism onto him, and also be kind of validated because he was real and he did exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that's the point I wanted to get back to. You did a very good job of taking us back full circle, which I appreciate. Because realistically, I mean, that's what it comes down to. Like, even today, we still have. I mean, so my first understanding of who Owen Glyndŵr came as a high school student looking things up in a library, and because I was curious to know more about Wales in general, and the exposure I got from him was through poets who were writing at the time, through the scholars that were writing their own version of the history in later, obviously in more modern era. And it was really sort of romantic in the way it was written generally. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I do think you have to be cognizant that there are real people behind the stories, and you need to accept that sometimes they have flaws and sometimes they're not necessarily the nicest people in the world. Like, we the example I could bring up from past episodes would be Llewellyn the Great, because Llewellyn the Last, actually, sorry, because his storyline effectively becomes one of a lost opportunity. This is a guy who had done all these brilliant things, had united the kingdom, blah, blah, blah. But the reality of it is, it's also a story of someone stubborn and so unwilling to bend that even at the end, he couldn't see what was coming because his own perception of things was so slanted. And he'd gotten to the point where he just wasn't going to accept that he'd lost effectively. And I think that that's both the great thing about him, but it's also the bad part, because it does lead to these kind of situations, but that doesn't make him somehow lesser because of that. That just makes him human, because we all have these kind of problems. So I love that kind of thing, when you can kind of get into who the person is and kind of understand them. But I mean, myths are things that we use to sort of understand the world, and I think they have a lot of value in and of themselves. So I always find it really interesting to sort of see how this kind of ideal of Arthur then sort of transfers to Glyndŵr to an extent, and how kind of that ideal that he might come back simply because we don't know where he died does become sort of a myth-making thing. And because he was the last real successful individual who became native Prince of Wales, it even, I think, makes a stronger connection in a way that other things wouldn't have if that continued struggle. Like, I think of Scotland, where there's many, many examples of characters that you could use from Scottish history who were important to keeping Scotland independent. And they're, in some ways mentioned, but nowhere are they wrapped up in the same level of myth making as I think people like Glyndŵr are, because of what came after.
Well, yeah, definitely. And as you were saying about, it's really great when you can kind of read the actual human details about someone outside of their myth and legend. I think that's what's so great about Owen Glyndŵr as well, or Glendower, I'm not quite sure. But he's definitely, he was using romanticism and myth and legend at the time as well, when he was actually revolting. For example, you could say he didn't start out with this idea of representing the Welsh against the English. He was a lord, on a borderland between England and Wales, who had parts of his land seized by a neighbouring lord, and was just a bit grumpy about that. So you could say what started off as a simple tiff between lords then became so powerful. It captured the kind of hearts and minds of people at the time. You had scholars, Welsh scholars in Oxford University going back home to Wales. You had Welsh craftsmen working in England going back home to Wales. I don't think that Owain started his kind of petty rivalry with a neighbouring lord knowing that it was going to become so powerful, knowing that it was going to get that kind of importance and significance to it. I think only afterwards did he ascribe this kind of mythic Welsh hero to himself, when he pronounced himself the Prince of Wales. Only then did he kind of use his hereditary lineage, if you will. I think beforehand it was about one thing, then it became another. So as I was saying earlier, all movements need a figurehead, and I think he realised that he was a figurehead for Welsh revolt against the English. But I don't think, I'm not a scholar on this subject, so there might be scholars listening that think, oh God, what is she talking about? But I wouldn't say for certain that he started off with this agenda, if you know what I mean.
No, I just from what I've been able to read so far, I would agree. I think it's something where it kind of came about after the fact. I think it helps when you have good propaganda, and one of the things that he definitely had was some good propaganda, because his bards were out there kind of talking about him in such a way, both before and after, as sort of that mythic figure. But I don't think that's where it began. I don't think that was, I think you're correct, because there were things going on in Wales at the time that as I say, we'll get to where the revolts were coming. But Glyndwr was a part of the English nobility. He was, a supporter of Richard II. He was not someone who was looking to be a to use a modern parlance, separatist. He was someone who had been embedded with that ideal for quite some time, and there was no reason for him to just rush to do this. But whenever it seems like you get into disputes between nobility in this era and the king decides to favor one over the other, it was always a sign that, well, it's time to go against the king. And I think that was the bigger driving force. Like you say, I don't think he initially started out with that concept in mind, but it just so happened that it was at a perfect time period where the Welsh public were needing someone like that or wanting someone like that. I mean, they were throwing the English categorically across the nation at that point, and it had nothing to do with him.
I think that you're absolutely 100% correct. You've got all these people, all these very important figures in history who had people rally around them. I think a lot of the time it was just about timing. They said the right things at the right time for the right audience. There was kind of, like you said, things were happening anyway. So there were sparks happening across Wales, happening across England anyway. And then he happened to come along and bang, then there was a fire. It was definitely the correct timing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I could go on about this for a while, but I've kept you here for an hour. So I think this is probably a good spot to end. And I know it's later for you than me. Where can we find you out there in the interwebs?
Oh, out there in the darkened, no, not the dark web. I don't know why I said
No,
that.
not the dark web. We don't talk about that.
Yeah. please don't look there. I don't really know what that even is, to be honest. You can find me on Twitter as Siân Esther. I post a lot about history and folklore and things like that. But primarily, if you're interested in myths and legends, especially pertaining to Wales, which I'm assuming your listeners will be, you can find my podcast at Celtic Myths Pod on Twitter. It's the Celtic Myths and Legends Podcast. So I'm on iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify, and I think most of the other ones, I hope. I'm not really quite sure where I am. But, the podcast surfaces up quite a bit, so you can find me on there. So that's what I would direct you.
Mm-hmm. And I have listened to a few of the episodes. I really like it. I think you really do a great job kind of covering these ideas and getting across so many cool aspects that, for sure. Please go check it out. And if anybody has any further questions or comments or concerns or anything else, you can reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, on Twitter at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And you can contact us on anything else, on any other subject, at distractionsmedia.com. Until next time, everyone, take care. Have a great day. Bye.
This has been a Distractions Media production, and for everything we do, check out distractionsmedia.com.
A news story gets shared by a friend on social media, or you catch a tweet that really makes your blood boil. But how do you separate fact from fiction? That's the premise behind Disinformation, a 10-part series from Evergreen Podcasts and Emergent Risk International, coming this fall. Tune into Disinformation wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, don't believe everything you read.